Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This is your Peach update for the 21st. Well, as I'm recording this, Schiff is grilling David Holmes. Yeah, grilling, right? Okay. Very friendly one side prosecutor deal, right? I mean, that's just kind of how that goes. There's a real problem with what you're seeing in the press, though, and this is actually quite serious. And that I've pointed out before, which is that all you hear is the prosecution side if you read the press. In other words, all you hear is the Democrats and the prepared statements. If you were a juror in a trial and you stepped out to take a piss every time the defense counsel got up from the chair, you would never find anyone not guilty of anything, ever. I mean, it's the job of the prosecution to make its best case, and if you hear no rebuttals, well, that's a problem. And very rarely does a prosecution witness during direct examination by the prosecution say something so stupidly inimical, because one of the first things you learn is that if you're on the stand, you let the attorney ask the question, you answer it, and beyond that, you shut up. But of course, in this case, we have witnesses that are, for the most part, quite biased. And it's rather interesting. Some of them, even people that you'd think wouldn't be. I mean, Sonderland, for example. How do I know if that guy's a never Trumper or not? Just because he's a Republican doesn't mean he's in favor of Trump. Trump did give him his job, but who knows what's going on there? All right. One of the things that I find so interesting about this so-called process is that when you get there, and you start listening to the other side of this, every time these people come back under questioning from the other side, they end up admitting that they actually don't have the facts to back up their conclusions. In other words, they didn't actually hear the phone call in question. They don't have any notes. They don't have any contemporary notes. They all, Sonderland claims basically that he was obstructed in getting the information from the State Department that he needs to properly present himself, so to speak. And that was the reason for the differences in his deposition and his open testimony. Essentially, what Sonderland did was generate a obstruction of justice impeachment charge for Adam Schiff, which you can bet is going to happen. Right. I also want to talk real quickly. By the way, we'll do the debate at the end, just so you know. So then after that, though, the under questioning, it becomes admitted by Sonderland that in fact he didn't have firsthand knowledge, because in fact the only conversation that Sonderland had with President Trump about this in a firsthand sort of thing, the only conversation he had was that he wanted him to execute on his campaign promises to root out corruption. He specifically said he didn't want a quid pro quo. And that's the direct conversation. Now, maybe that's because Trump realized that he was in a lot of trouble, and so that was the conversation he had with Sonderland. But where are the fact witnesses who can prove that, in fact, there was bribery? And remember, for there to be bribery, the person on the other end has to know that they're being bribed or blackmail. Okay? In other words, you got to do this, or this is going to happen. By the way, bribery is not really the right. Well, I guess maybe it would be. It would be if you were giving something, but in this case, you're not giving something. He was holding something back. So I think blackmail or extortion is probably a better charge. Probably extortion would be what I would think would be the correct sort of charge to level. But that's assuming that you can show some evidence of it. And so far, I haven't seen any. So if there's no evidence, then where are you going with this, guys? And so, this has been the repeated pattern in these hearings, is that you've had these people get up there, the press breathlessly reports that, this person confirmed this and this person, and actually, no, they didn't, because 15 minutes later or 45 minutes later, depending on when this supposed thing comes in, after the Democratic Council, after Goldman gets done, and the other side gets their turn, they start getting asked, well, so did you hear the president say blah? No. What did the president say to you during this particular? Well, he said, "I don't want a quid pro quo. I want the Ukrainian president to execute out his campaign promises." Then you have the thing that came out this morning, and it has been a recurring talking point that the Ukrainians did not interfere in our election, but of course the Russians did. Well, let me explain something. More than one person can do a thing at a time. Okay. Secondly, our own press reported. In 2017, Politico, a very hard left-leaning press at that in fact, the Ukrainians were the ones that were interfering as well as the Russians. And the Ukrainians were favoring Clinton. And they found themselves in quite a box when Hillary lost because they were advocating for this. And this was well known throughout both the security apparatus and within the White House. And oops. Here, the wrong guy won. Oh, crap. Now we've got a problem with our relationship. And Trump knew this too, which, incidentally, is a perfectly good reason for him to be very skeptical of anybody actually doing anything. Because, there's, well, you really didn't want me to win, and I did. So now you got to deal with me. That's just too bad. And so, what we're hearing now is this, this recollection. This is the whole point of bringing Holmes in, is he was supposedly there where he could hear this conversation. He was part of this conversation. And that this was, we have to have these investigations. Well, we'll see. We're going to find out how well this holds up. But this is, this is the classic way that you do things, right? You bring people in, they make assertions. The guy who makes the assertion gets torn apart, all right? And then hopefully, if you've really got something, the guy comes out on the other side and says, no, and I can prove it. And then the game's over. All right. So, this is what everybody is expecting, is somebody's going to come up with this. But we keep hearing that it's going to be this guy. It's going to be this guy. It was going to be Sunderland. Well, it wasn't Sunderland. It was a dog that didn't bark. All right. So now we got Hale and Fiona. We'll see how this works out. I'm going to be paying attention to it for the rest of the day. But I just don't see anything there. All right, one last thing. Democrat debate last night. Are there any serious people in the room? The only person who actually got anything out of their mouth that made some sense was Kamala Harris, and just because she was being a tough SOB. And that's all, okay? That's all. So, God, Sanders, there's no there. But I think, like I said, I think he's done. Okay, and just simply on the health side of things, I know there's a lot of people who really like him, but I think he's done. But Buttigieg did not manage to capitalize on any of the gains in the polling that he's been making. That's going to turn into a problem, and I think he's got a race issue that's going to get him. I mean, it's terrible to say you need to be a woman or a minority to be the Democrat nominee, but I think there may actually be something to that in today's world. That's how far to the fringe that the Democrat Party has moved. I mean, I don't care how you slice this, folks, okay? Minorities are still called minorities. Now, someday whites will be in the minority, and then I guess we'll be the ones that we'll be the ones that will have to be nominees because we'll be a minority. But I mean, that there's a litmus test like this in a political organization is crazy, but there is. Whether we like it or not, it exists. The problem that you have with all the people that are in that fringe zone is that they're just dropping like flies. All right, I mean, Yang got absolutely nowhere last night. He got nothing. He got nothing out of that at all. And honestly, I don't think Buttigieg got anywhere either. And he's gay, so that makes him a member of a minority, and that gives him his qualifications. That's why he can actually be up there on the stage. Bernie doesn't have any of that going for him. He's just a crazy socialist. Warren, I don't think, really did anything either, but she stays in the game. She didn't do anything stupid. She just didn't do anything to really stand out. And one of the things that I think is interesting about this is what I don't understand about Warren and her candidacy is that, she's got up there with the whole scold thing, which that's a really dangerous card to play as a politician. It's very hazardous. It can work. Okay. Oh, it's just 2 cents. All right. The problem is then people tear apart what you said, and then they put the condescension on top of it, and you can have a really big problem with that. All right. So I'm not so sure. I am not at all so sure about what that's about. All right. And how that's going to play for her. But she didn't move the needle. And why doesn't she bring up with this Medicare for All thing? Why doesn't she bring up that right now, if you have health insurance through your job, you are getting screwed out of $10,000 that ought to be yours? And you'll never see it. And people scream about the cost, but we're going to tax that money that company is currently paying, so it won't hurt the company any more than it's already being hurt. And that's where the funding is going to come from. All right. Well, I suspect part of the reason is the Chamber of Commerce would then start talking about the sky is falling, every restaurant in America is going to close, blah, 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 blah. That kind of stuff would start. But I don't understand why she doesn't make an issue out of this, because it is, everyone talks about this $53 trillion number, but the truth is that the $53 trillion, which is $5.3 trillion a year, is actually below the midpoint of where we'll be 10 years from now, between now and 10 years from now, in terms of total medical spend at current growth rates. So if you take that section of the economy and federalize it, essentially, it's from my point of view, it's bad in a number of different ways. But the idea that it is somehow going to dynamically change the curve of spending, the amount of spending, is just nonsense. All it's going to change is where the money comes from and which pocket it comes out of. And so, whether or not it's taken into the federal government in one way or it's not and spent directly, doesn't make any difference. Now, the other thing she was pointing out is that there's going to be some administrators that are going to lose their jobs. And that's one that I saw, and people were like, well, yeah, that'll happen. Guys and gals realize that the true impact of what she's talking about in terms of the number of people who would lose those positions is very small compared to what the real number is. And that's because socialism maintains most of the inefficiencies. That's where the Republicans should be attacking this. But they don't want to go after the cost issue either, because if they do, then the market crashes. And so this is the dance in the Democrat Party and in the Democrat debates. Nobody wants to touch the real issue, which is price. It is, in fact, I retweeted one of my old articles. You might remember the one with the first letters. They came down to saying, blow me pharma. And I did that on purpose. I will go ahead and put that link in the article here that accompanies this podcast, because if you haven't read it since it was written quite a long time ago, you ought to go back and read it, because it would solve a huge percentage of the problem. And then, of course, the bill that I put out, the model bill, that's an expansion on this. But as I've said before, these problems are not all that hard to solve. They're just very politically different. They're not going to happen until and unless the American people stand up and say, this needs to happen now. The people need to get off their butt and do it, or the consequence is going to actually be worse than a politician getting voted out of office. And I don't know if that's, you could say, well, gee, that's awfully close to armed revolt, advocating for really ugly, illegal things. Well, actually, no, it isn't. Because the reality of the situation is that the idea that the federal government and state governments have authority over us is just nonsense. They don't. All governments exist only with the consent of the governed. That's always been true. All right. And I could point out that there is plenty of evidence that this country has gone through cycles before where the people did not have to openly turn around and say, I'm going to shoot you if you don't do it. Okay. And yet that the trust and confidence in the government was at the verge of being lost. Civil unrest was part of that, but was not the whole thing. It was simply this. If you don't cut this out, there's going to be trouble. And it doesn't have to be illegal trouble. It can be strikes. It can be a general strike. It can be a decision to occupy a city and say, we're not leaving until you take care of this, without looting, without burning, without damaging anything. Just, look, we're going to shut down commerce. We're going to do it peacefully. And people say, oh, well, that's illegal too. Well, actually, how's it any different than what's going on in Hong Kong right now? Isn't that for the most part? Leave aside the petrol bombs. Okay. Yeah, all right. Arson is not part of that. But we're going to march through the middle of town and close it all up. That's not a violent act. And have we not had that happen in this country before? We most certainly have. So are there solutions to this that don't involve take the nation and destroy it? Of course there are. The problem is, and in fact they've happened before. The problem is this. What we have in this country is a bunch of people that are diverted with this nonsense about fun and games, and yet not the real things. Although last night, folks, the House passed, which shocked me. I didn't think it would happen. They passed the resolution, a bill coming out of the Senate in support of Hong Kong, and sent it to the president's desk. I need to go in there and see if there's any actual teeth in it. I doubt that there is, but you could bet that is going to piss off the Chinese. So things are about to get interesting over there too. You have a good one, and I'll be with you tomorrow.